This should be an interesting first exercise. See what you guys came up with. Again, I'm going to ask the people on the live chat as well as people in the room to maybe mention some of the classes that they came up with. What are the different layout elements that we're going to have in this particular design? So shout it out. What do we got?
Side header.
Side header. I'm just going to make a note of these. Side header. Anything else?
So the grid system that includes containers and all the grids.
Yeah. Could have a grid system in here. I'll just keep it generic and grid, and containers and all that kind of fun stuff. What else might we have on this?
Featured or featured episodes.
The featured, yep. With a featured box up there. Cool.
Sidebar.
Sidebar.
Footer.
Footer.
Content.
And content. So, seems pretty straightforward, right? So a couple of things, and really one of the reasons why I wanted to go through this exercise is to plant that seed. Plant the seed of, when we take a look at a design like this, what is it that we're interested in? So we have this gray section up at the very top, this dark gray section up at the top. We have this light gray section in the middle. And then if we scroll down to the bottom, we have this dark gray section at the bottom. And the other thing that we can notice is that this is a fixed width design. I may be actually a little surprised it's a fixed width design, but it is. And what kind of constraints come from dealing with a fixed width design? So looking at the design, for example, you'll notice that the background color goes edge to edge, but the content itself actually is locked to a specific dimension, which means, like, in order to actually get that to work, we're going to have one div inside of another, right? So the inside div is going to be the one that's constrained, and the one that's on the outside is the one that has the background color that's going to go to the edge. So we can start to see here, well, the header, the content area, and the footer all share this constrained design. So as a result of that, how do we want to choose to constrain that design? There are a couple ways that we could do it. We could do something like sidebar, footer, or probably not sidebar. We might have like maybe main, footer, header, and each of those has, let's say, a width of 760, right? That we can say, okay, all of these things share the same thing. Or we can come up with a name that is a little bit more descriptive of what they're all doing. They're all doing exactly the same thing. In this case, I should type the word I wanted to type. My brain's not working. Layout constrained. I'm indicating that this is a layout element, and it's constrained to a specific width. In this case, 760 pixels. And so when I go to my HTML, I'm going to have my class equals layout constrained.
And clarify it's a width.
Sorry?
And you have to clarify that it's a width.
Yes, I should type proper CSS. Thank you very much. I'm definitely on the ball this morning. So yeah, we have this layout constrained with a width of 760 pixels, and we have, we've specified in our HTML that we're going to have this layout constrained, and we're going to have that for each of those sections. So we've got the section up at the top, we've got the section in the middle, and we've got the section at the bottom that are all going to have that layout constrained. Now the other thing is that what we're trying to do is identify repeating patterns. So I mentioned that a little bit with the modules, right? Like, what is the things that we're repeating and recognizing? Well, the drop-down was similar to this drop-down, was similar to the contact card, where they were all essentially the same thing. So yes, we have a header, yes, we have a footer, but what is consistent between them. They actually both have this background color that goes all the way to the edge, and it's the same background for the footer as it is for the header. Can we reuse some styles here? And again, yes, we could do header, comma, footer, and in there say they both have this background. Or we can come up with a name that identifies the fact that these two are different. Or we want to come up with something that identifies that the main content is different. So which direction do we want to go in? We could go in either direction. In this particular case, I would actually probably say that if this page was too short, I actually want that gray background to be like the default, the dark gray be the default, and have the light gray be something special. And because of that I am going to come out with something to indicate that that main content area is highlighted, that it's going to have a different color. So in this case, it's going to have a different background that is probably a lighter gray than sort of my default body styles. And I'm just going to clean up a little bit of this. So our default body style might have a background color that is that dark gray. And then I want to highlight the main body region and say that it has that lighter gray. I'd want to specify font color as well as background color for accessibility. But that header just has a default look and feel. My content area is now going to have that layout highlight. And that my footer is going to have its own thing as well. So we've got the header, we've got the content, and we've got the footer. And so you'll notice here, I've got each of the containers that I care about, but so far I've only got 2 CSS classes. I don't have a header and a footer. I've just got one. I don't have to create like a header inside to constrain everything. I've just got this one class. So I've identified what the repeating patterns are and created class names that help identify what those things are. Now, looking back at the design, there is certainly still some other layout elements that we have here. In this case, we have this featured area up at the top. We've got this content area on the side, and we have this sidebar over here. But you kind of notice this visual pattern of each of these things. Like there's a box around that featured area that is the same around this box here in the content area that is the same as this box in each of the sidebar elements, right? So we start to recognize, oh, you know what, this thing is different than, it's not really like one layout featured, it's this box, and recognizing, okay, this box is the repeating pattern, right? We're looking at the design, we're not looking at the content. If I say featured, I'm talking about content, I'm talking about that intro thing. If I try to come up with a name like shows or episodes or anything like that, I'm identifying the content, I'm not identifying the visual patterns that I'm seeing within the site. So I still have some other layout classes that I'm going to need. I still am going to have this content area. I need some way of like dividing that main body area at the bottom into the 2 columns. So I still need to be able to do that. So I am going to still have a a content area and a sidebar. And now I'm going to get into naming convention a little bit, but I'm just going to drop this little hint in here. What I want to do is be very explicit in what these things are. So these are layout elements. So the sidebar is a layout element. It's going to be this container. It's going to be a specific width, and I'm just going to throw a bunch of different boxes in there. The content, again, is this sort of main block. That might have different things in there. it's also important, and I didn't mention this with this exercise, that you'll start to see, like, okay, what happens when I actually drill in to a particular thing? And yeah, you can kind of see there is kind of like this featured thing up at the top, this big box, but that when I scroll down, I've got, you know, my main content area and I have my sidebar. You'll notice the widths are a little bit different here than it was on the home page. What does that mean? But from a layout perspective, you know, I am dealing with slightly different content, but laid out in slightly different ways, and how do we plan for those variations? But ultimately, you know, this covers most use cases. You know, if we look at that page here, we can kind of see that this section does have a slightly different background color for that featured area. So I'll need to come up with something else to identify that. And this is where we start to see how naming things can be a little bit difficult. So yes, I've highlighted sort of the main content area, but how do I indicate that this featured section up at the top also has a different color? And there's no right or wrong here. We can come up with any number of classes, and these are the opportunities for you to discuss with your team how to name things. So for this, you know, I could do something like really highlighted, you know, if I wanted to. I might come up with, I could come up with something like featured to indicate that that top section is kind of featured. It stands out from everything else. Headings already have sort of this level of priority. What's interesting is that design, as sort of this overall thing, is about priorities, right? What stuff is more important? What stuff is less important? And how do we make things more important? We change the color of it. We make it bigger. You know, we try to make things stand out. Things that are less important, we make them smaller. We make the colors more subdued. We kind of blend them in. And if we look at HTML and the fact that, like, you have H1, H2, H3, H4, they're identifying the priorities of each one, that we could actually use a naming convention here to also indicate priority, which one is more important than the other. That I could you know, change the word to sort of highlight 2, and then have highlight 1 that might be more important than highlight 2, depending on when I want to use certain things. And it's at this point where documentation starts to become really important. Right? When do I want to decide to use highlight 1 over highlight 2? And finding a way of communicating that with your teammates. And we'll get into documentation a while later. I'm going to take this opportunity to open the floor for some questions before I jump into the next section. Does anybody have any questions about the categorization that we've talked about so far, and why we might take this particular approach?
So I have a question about highlight.
Yep.
So why is highlight a layout element? Isn't it like more like a theme, or it's a color, correct? It has nothing to do with sort of the structure. It's just coloring a layout area.
Yep.
But it isn't necessarily layout itself.
It's not layout in the sense of providing width, but layout in the sense that it is a container that's going to contain a bunch of stuff. The reason why I don't categorize it as theming is going back to what I was mentioning before about how most sites don't require theming as its own layer. In other words, I'm going to create a box, and on this site, that background color for that header is dark gray. But I don't need to create another like theme that just has background color gray in it. Like that, I'm not going to set certain properties to be on one class and certain properties to be on another class and identify those as completely separate things. I just have this HTML element, and I need to say what it looks like, but it's still just a container. It's a box that I need to put stuff into.
And you wouldn't categorize that as a module, having a box like a well that Bootstrap would have?
So the difference between a layout and a module, for me, is about that sort of separation of like the actual content and what the content goes into. So to me, like a grid system is layout. There's no saying what the content is that's going in them versus like tabs. Well, tabs are very specific. It's not going to have like large descriptive text. I can't put necessarily other modules in that. The tab is just going to have a title, maybe a close button. Like there's certain constraints that come with putting something into a module. Whereas a layout is a lot more broad. Now that's a pretty kind of gray line. And if you wanted to say layouts are just the same as modules, you could. In a lot of cases, everything is really just a module, just with different names thrown at it. I mean, a grid system could be considered a module, or it can be considered layout. But for me, I differentiate the two based on sort of the scope of what those elements are trying to do.
I hear you. So you're saying that the layout highlight is a box that contains anything.
Yeah.
And that's why it's a layout.
Yep. Cool.
All right, and then it's also, I'd like to get your perspective, but what we're trying to do is decouple layout from design.
Yes.
Modules, to make it easier for designers to prototype. So that's at least the way I have envisioned. We have a grid system. Grid system is a layout, and then you develop your module. That's a design within the layout. So having that separation, I feel like it helps a team scale and be a little more productive.
Yeah, for me, it's, I mean, you could certainly look at it that way. The concern there is that, like, when you say the design, like, yes, a lot of the intricacies of the design will exist at the module level. But while the design here, you know, I've got the dark gray boxes and the light gray boxes, what I'm really just trying to do is yes, it's still just a box that I need to have some constraints with. The layout is going to define the width, and this is another sort of pattern that we'll touch on a little bit later. And that one of the patterns of layout is that layout defines width. In this case, there's really no width to it because it's just a full width container that just goes out to the edge. But layout constrained has a specific width. My grid system might have specific widths that it breaks up things, and then the module doesn't. It stretches to fit whatever container it's in. And that gives us that flexibility, right? I can move module from the main content area to a sidebar, or I can move it from a desktop view to a mobile view. And that module just stretches to fit the container that it's in, whereas the layout actually defines some constraints around that layout. So the content area, you know, I've got layout content and layout sidebar might be side by side, or they might be stacked. I might have a 6:1 grid ratio for content sidebar on the home page, but on the inside page that it becomes 4:1. That the dimensions change based on what I need to prioritize for that particular section. But the modules themselves actually can move around and will fill the container that they're in.
And I guess it was for that exact reason why I was confused about layout highlight, because I see it as a box that's just being constrained. It can fit anywhere, really. It's just a box.
Because to me, it's the outer container. Like it's just this outer thing. I would still consider it a layout, but that, for me, because of like I've got my base and I've got my layout as the next layer on top of that, that it is the outside, and that everything else goes inside that. That's why I kind of visualize things that way. And even though here there's no specific width to it, there could be. I could constrain that. I might need to do certain things for the mobile layout. But for the most part, it's an outside container, and because of that, I would still consider it a layout, even though it has some visual style to it. And you'll find that with a lot of layouts, you are going to have to put some minimal style to them. Like you're probably not going to have box shadow and border radius. Usually once you start throwing border radius or borders on something, it's probably a module. But you are going to have background colors, you're going to have text colors, because you're going to say, okay, this thing, this massive box is going to have a whole bunch of stuff in it. Yes?
There's a question from chat. noticing that you rely on classes for the containers instead of IDs. Why wouldn't you use an ID, and would it ever be appropriate to use an ID?
So we're actually going to touch on class versus ID when we jump into naming convention. So maybe to leak out a little bit ahead of schedule, from a CSS perspective, there is not any difference between an ID and a class from an implementation perspective. In other words, I could put a class or an ID on something, and it will style it. I could have multiple IDs, and my JavaScript will probably break, but my CSS doesn't care. Right? I could actually have 3 elements with the same ID, and CSS will still style them, all exactly the same. Because all it cares about is identifying something and styling the way it looks. So the moment I throw an ID on something, I've actually just made my life more difficult, because now to change that, if I have 2 things competing on a specific element, then I need to increase my selectors. I need to use bang important. I've essentially made my life a little bit harder by using an ID over a CSS, over a class. The other thing that you'll find is that we always kind of look at things in the here and now, and we say, I've only got one of these things. But in a project that changes, we often find ourselves in a situation that where we may only have one instance of it now, we may not in the future. And so this is about mitigating change. If from a CSS perspective, whether I put an ID or a class makes no difference, then I should start from the very basic and easiest foundation instead of the hardest. And so we'll touch a little bit on that.